The United States government owes $38.3 trillion. That is the largest debt any nation has carried in human history. And here's the strange part. It still might not be the most indebted country on this map. Now, add up every government's debts, and the world owes $110.9 trillion. That is more money than every human being on Earth earns in a year combined. This map ranks the borrowers two ways, by the raw pile and by what the pile does to them. The two lists do not agree. That disagreement is the whole story. We start in Spain, which owes $1.8 trillion. That is 101% of everything the Spanish economy produces in a year. Every euro Spain earns in 12 months is already spoken for before breakfast. Madrid calls this progress, because a decade ago, the ratio was heading somewhere far worse. Across the Atlantic, Brazil owes $2 trillion. That is roughly $9,000 for every Brazilian, in a country where wages are a fraction of Europe's. And Brazil pays some of the highest interest rates of any major economy, so the meter runs fast. Now for the first surprise. Canada, the sensible one, owes $2.5 trillion. That is 112% of its entire economy, a higher ratio than Britain's. The country with the polite reputation quietly owes more than everything it makes in a year. Nobody puts that on the postcards. Meanwhile, Germany owes $3.1 trillion. And here the map turns sarcastic. That enormous number is only 65% of German output, the leanest ratio on this list. Germany borrows the way it queues, reluctantly and with visible discomfort. 4 decades of fiscal caution bought a huge debt that still somehow counts as restraint. India owes $3.4 trillion, which is about 80% of its economy. But India is the one borrower here growing fast enough to outrun its own debt. Growth is the only painless exit ever discovered. Almost nobody else on this map has it. Italy does not have it. Rome owes $3.5 trillion, 137% of its economy. Italy has carried that load for 30 years without collapsing, which economists find genuinely annoying. It survives because Italians save and because they lend the money to their own government. France owes $3.9 trillion at 106% of its economy. That number has already consumed several French governments. Prime ministers keep falling over budgets meant to tame it. Borrowed money looks free right up until somebody has to name the cuts. In Paris, naming the cuts ends careers. Then comes Britain, at $4.1 trillion, 94% of everything the UK produces. The last time British debt sat this high, the country was still paying off the Second World War. Some of the people now lending to the Treasury can remember rationing, and now the map flips. Japan owes $9.8 trillion, the third biggest pile on Earth, but measure that pile against the economy beneath it, and it comes to 230%. That is the highest ratio of any nation on the planet. This country owes more than double everything it produces in a year. 2 full years of national output already owed. So why hasn't Japan collapsed? Because it mostly owes the money to itself. The Bank of Japan holds roughly half the government's bonds, and Japanese savers hold much of the rest. A family can carry a debt like that for a very long time. It just can't ever put it down. Second on that grim ratio list is Sudan at 222%. Not because Sudan borrowed like Japan, but because war collapsed its economy. Divide old debts by a ruined economy, and the ratio explodes. Sudan's number isn't extravagance, it's a wound. Third is Singapore at 76%, and it's the trick answer on the exam. Singapore borrows heavily, then parks the proceeds in one of the largest investment funds on Earth. It owes a fortune and is worth a larger one. Greece, at 107%, still carries Europe's heaviest burden, and Greeks lived through the invoice once already. Back on the raw pile, number 2 is China, which officially owes $18.7 trillion. That is nearly half the American total, built in a fraction of the time. And it is only the ledger Beijing publishes. Count the borrowing buried inside local governments, and the true figure runs trillions higher, which brings the map back to where it began. The United States owes $38.3 trillion, more than China, Japan, and Britain combined. That works out to about $113,000 for every American man, woman, and child. And the pile grows by roughly $8 billion every single day, weekends included. Now, here is what that costs. Last year, Washington paid $970 billion in interest alone. That is more than the entire Pentagon budget. America now spends more on old borrowing than on defending itself. None of that money builds a road, a school, or a ship. It buys the past on an installment plan. So, who owes the most? By the pile, America. By the burden, Japan. Both keep functioning because national debt is a promise between generations, the living borrowing from people not yet born. The $100 trillion question is whether they'd have agreed to the loan. Next time, half of humanity lives in these cities.